Have you ever stepped onto a plane, hoping for nothing more than a safe trip, only to feel the sting of being treated as if you didn't belong? Imagine waiting quietly with your child, only to have a flight attendant dismiss your needs, belittle your dignity, and threaten to remove you from the aircraft, all while others were shown kindness for the very same mistakes. Now, what if the man quietly watching this unfold wasn't just another passenger, but the very owner of the airline, traveling incognito to see how his staff treated people when no one was looking? In that moment, every choice mattered. Should he reveal his identity to stop the injustice immediately, or stay silent long enough to witness the truth of what prejudice looks like in real time? And the deeper question for you, the viewer, if it had been you or your child humiliated in front of strangers, how would you have reacted? Would you have stayed quiet or spoken up? This isn't just a story about an airline. It's a story about dignity, justice, and what happens when compassion meets power. Stay with us, like, share, and subscribe, because this is one story you will not forget. The morning sun had just begun to cut through the clouds above Chicago O'Hare, painting streaks of gold against the glass walls of Terminal C. Travelers bustled in every direction, dragging rolling bags, clutching coffee cups, making hurried calls. Among them moved a man who didn't look like he belonged to the upper deck of a premium airline cabin. He wore a dark gray hoodie, faded jeans, and carried a backpack that had seen better days. His sneakers were clean but ordinary, the kind you'd expect on a school teacher or maybe a mechanic heading to a family reunion. He didn't exude wealth or power, not in the way most people imagined. He looked ordinary, that was the point. His name was David Lawson, age 48, founder and CEO of Summit Airlines, a billionaire on paper, with business columns calling him one of the most visionary black entrepreneurs of his generation. Yet, today, no one recognized him. He preferred it that way. Tucked in the side pocket of his backpack was a slim leather notebook. That notebook was his compass. Every time he traveled incognito, he filled its pages with observations, words overheard, notes on behavior. He had been hearing trouble in reports, passengers of color writing emails, staff whispering about bias in service. Too many small things that added up to something bigger. He needed to see it for himself. David approached the gate counter, scanned his boarding pass, and gave the agent a polite nod. She barely looked up, but the machine beeped green. He stepped down the jet bridge into the narrow fuselage, where the air already carried the familiar blend of coffee, sanitizer, and metal. At the cabin door stood Janet Miller, the lead flight attendant. She had 22 years of service stitched into her posture, the kind of confidence that came with knowing the routine by heart. She greeted the couple ahead of him with a broad smile, her voice lilting. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Whitefield. Always a pleasure to have you with us again." David waited his turn, offering a faint smile. Janet's eyes flicked over his hoodie, down to the scuffed straps of his backpack. Her smile faded almost instantly. "Sir," she said, tone clipped, "this section is for business class passengers." David met her gaze steadily, his voice calm. "I know. This is my seat." He handed over the stub with 4A printed clearly. Janet's lips pressed into a thin line. "Very well," she muttered, stepping aside. He walked into the premium cabin, sliding into the leather seat. The Whitefields, the couple she had welcomed so warmly, settled across the aisle. Mrs. Whitefield gave him a once-over, the kind that weighed and measured, then leaned into her husband with a whisper that wasn't quiet enough. Strange, isn't it? Business class standards are slipping. David ignored it. He set his backpack under the seat, pulled the notebook onto his lap, and scribbled his first line of the day boarding tone differential in greetings. Warm for Whitefields, cold for Lawson. The cabin filled quickly. Among the last to board was a black woman in her 30s, her hair tied back in a bun, carrying a tote bag that looked far too heavy for her shoulders. Her son trailed behind, clutching a small blue backpack covered with superhero patches. The boy's eyes widened at the rows of polished leather seats. "Mom," he whispered, "these look like the seats in movies." His mother, Clara Johnson, smiled faintly, though fatigue pulled at her expression. "Don't touch everything. Ethan, let's just sit down." They found their seats one row behind David. Clara struggled to fit the tote into the overhead bin. Janet appeared, arms crossed. "Ma'am, you'll need to hurry. You're holding up boarding. I'm sorry," Clara said softly, adjusting the bag. A white businessman 2 rows ahead shoved his oversized roller into the bin without a word from Janet. David noticed, so did Ethan. The boy tugged his mother's sleeve. "Why do they look at us like that?" he asked in a small voice. Clara hushed him quickly. David lowered his eyes to the notebook again, his pen moving, tone of reprimand selective, child's perception, early awareness of bias. For a moment, the cabin hummed with the usual symphony of boarding seat belts clicking, overhead, bins slamming, muffled announcements. Yet beneath it, David felt the weight of something else, something familiar. A story he had lived before, as a boy traveling with his mother who was told they were in the wrong place on a bus, in a restaurant, on a plane. He closed his notebook and leaned back, letting out a breath. He wasn't here just as an executive. He was here as that boy once more, only older, quieter, and with the power to write a different ending this time. The intercom crackled. Janet's voice carried over the speakers, firm and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Summit Airlines Flight 317 to Denver. Please stow your items and prepare for departure." David adjusted his seatbelt, eyes drifting to Clara and Ethan behind him. The boy's legs dangled off the seat, swinging nervously. Clara squeezed his hand, whispering reassurance. He tapped his pen against the notebook once more before writing, "Observation bias begins at boarding. Must watch what follows." The engines roared to life, a low vibration running through the cabin floor. The journey and the test had begun. The plane eased into its steady climb, pulling through the thin sheet of clouds until sunlight streamed through the windows. Business-class passengers reached for newspapers, headphones, or small bottles of water. Attendants moved briskly down the aisle, practicing the choreography of service they knew by heart. David Lawson leaned back, hands resting lightly on his notebook. He kept his gaze steady, not wanting to draw attention, but his ears caught every word, every subtle tone that distinguished one interaction from the next. The smallest details revealed the truth more than any corporate report ever could. When Janet Miller approached the Whitefields, her whole demeanor changed. She crouched slightly to meet Eleanor's eyes, speaking in a tone so warm it was nearly affectionate. "Mrs. Whitefield, can I get you the usual Chardonnay? And for Mr. Whitefield, the sparkling water with lemon." Robert Whitefield smiled, pleased that she remembered. "You always take such good care of us. Janet, that's why we keep flying Summit." Janet's laugh rang lightly, the kind of laugh meant to reassure and flatter. She adjusted Eleanor's blanket for her, smoothing it across her lap, a gesture so tender it seemed rehearsed. Directly behind them, Clara Johnson pressed the call button discreetly. Ethan had pulled his jacket tight, shivering a little against the air conditioning. Clara wanted a blanket. The button chimed once, then again after a pause. Janet, still crouched beside the Whitefields, ignored it. Another attendant walked by without glancing at Clara's row. David's pen scribbled quickly. Call, light ignored. Contrast with Whitefield's personal attention. Finally. Clara stood halfway and caught the eye of a younger attendant, Michael Torres. His uniform was still stiff, the creases suggesting newness. He stepped over quickly. "Yes, ma'am. What do you need?" Clara spoke softly, almost apologetically. "Could we have a blanket for my son? He's a little cold." Michael nodded. "Of course." He reached overhead into the supply compartment and handed Ethan a folded blanket. The boy smiled shyly. David noticed Janet watching from across the aisle, lips tightening. She waited until Michael moved on, then swept past Clara's row with an expression of irritation, muttering under her breath. Some passengers never learn to manage themselves. Clara lowered her eyes, pretending not to hear. But Ethan heard. He tugged on the blanket, pulling it up to his chin, his gaze flicking to David with a kind of quiet question. David gave him the smallest reassuring nod, though his jaw clenched at Janet's words. The drink service began. Janet wheeled the cart slowly, offering each row by name if she knew it. "Mr. Whitefield, Mrs. Whitefield, shall we start with your drinks?" She poured carefully, holding the stemware like crystal in a five-star hotel. When she reached Clara, the tone shifted again. "What do you want?" Clara hesitated. "Just some water for me, and apple juice for my son, if that's okay." Janet set the plastic cups down quickly, water sloshing onto the tray table, no napkin, no smile. She turned away before Clara could thank her. David's hand moved over his notebook, though he kept his eyes on the window, as though lost in thought. He wrote service differential, courtesy absent, visible to child. Clara dabbed at the water with tissues from her purse. Ethan whispered, "Mom, did we do something wrong?" "No, baby," she said gently, tucking the napkin under his cup. "We're fine." Across the aisle, Eleanor Whitefield leaned over, pretending to look at her magazine but clearly watching the exchange. She murmured something to Robert, her lips curling. David caught the word standards again, floating like a shadow over the row. David's mind went briefly inward, to a memory years earlier, his own mother clutching his hand on a bus, being told the front seats weren't for them. He remembered her silence, the way she endured so he wouldn't see her break. He had sworn then that if he ever gained power, he would make silence unnecessary. The cart rolled closer to him. Janet looked at his stub before speaking. "And you coffee. Black," David said simply. She poured it into a paper cup instead of the porcelain mugs used for others in business class. No saucer, no napkin, just the bare minimum. He accepted it without reaction, his voice steady. "Thank you." He let the cup rest on the tray, steam rising, his pen scratching one more note. Different vessels, different standards. The captain's voice filled the cabin, announcing smooth air ahead and a cruising altitude of 36,000 feet. Passengers relaxed. Some reclined their seats. Others scrolled through tablets. The rhythm of the flight settled in. a deceptive calm overlaying the tension David felt building. A few minutes later, Ethan pulled out a workbook from his backpack. Clara leaned over to help him with a math problem. The boy's pencil rolled off the tray and landed near the aisle. David bent down and picked it up before Janet passed again. He handed it back to Ethan with a smile. "Don't lose your tools, young man. They'll take you far." Ethan grinned. "Thanks, sir." Janet arrived at that moment, eyeing the scene. Her tone sharpened. "Please keep the aisles clear. We can't have people leaning over like that." David leaned back, unbothered. Of course. He felt the words she didn't say. People like you, people who don't belong here. They hung in the air heavier than any turbulence, from his seat across the aisle. Robert Whitefield chuckled softly, shaking his newspaper. "You'd think premium cabins would be a little more selective," he said to his wife. Eleanor gave a knowing look. Times are changing, not always for the better. Clara shifted in her seat, holding Ethan closer. David stayed silent, his pen pressing harder into the paper until the letters etched grooves into the page. Not subtle, explicit bias, witnessed by child. Michael passed again, refilling water for rows ahead. He noticed the paper cup on David's tray, frowned briefly, and looked at Janet, who ignored him. His mouth opened as if to say something, but he closed it again, swallowing the words. David caught the hesitation. He recognized it, the look of someone weighing risk against conscience. It was a look he had seen in boardrooms, in classrooms, even in his own reflection once upon a time. The flight continued smoothly, but for David, each moment was a note, each slide a tally in a growing column. He didn't need confirmation anymore. He had enough evidence for what he came to find. The only question left was when and how to reveal it. The engines hummed steady. The cabin looked calm to anyone glancing around. Yet beneath the surface, threads of tension were weaving themselves tighter, preparing for the moment they would inevitably snap. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and a murmur of relief passed through the cabin as passengers unbuckled and stretched. Flight attendants moved about with the ease of habit, adjusting curtains, collecting stray cups, checking that everyone had what they needed. For most travelers, it was an ordinary flight. For David Lawson, it was already something else entirely. From his vantage point in 4A, he had a clear view of both sides of the aisle. He watched as Janet Miller floated toward the Whitefields again, checking if they were comfortable, offering extra snacks not listed on the service sheet. Her voice softened into almost a purr when she spoke to them. "If you need anything at all, just let me know. We want you perfectly comfortable." Eleanor beamed. "You're always wonderful, Janet. This is why Summit is our airline." Behind them, Clara shifted slightly, raising her hand halfway as if uncertain whether she should draw attention. Ethan had finished his juice quickly, and she wanted to ask for water. She waited, her hand hovering. Janet's eyes brushed over her but didn't stop. She moved past, straight toward row 2 where another businessman was settling in. Clara lowered her hand. Ethan whispered, "She didn't see us." David noticed. He wrote, "Selective blindness acknowledged certain passengers, ignored others, witnessed by a child." The cabin grew quiet as the movie screens flickered to life. A family comedy played silently while passengers plugged in headsets. Ethan tugged on the connector but couldn't find the right jack. He tried again, fumbling with the cord. Janet walked by and paused. "Please don't play with the equipment, young man," she said curtly. It's not a toy." Clara opened her mouth, but Ethan sank into his seat, embarrassed. David leaned sideways, speaking just loud enough for them to hear. "Don't worry, it's confusing. Here, slot's right there." He pointed gently. Ethan's face lit with relief as the cartoon sound filled his ears. Janet glanced back, lips tight. "Sir, please let the crew handle passenger needs." "I was just helping," David replied evenly. "Well," she said, her tone heavy with disapproval, "please remember your place." The words lingered in the air, sharp as broken glass. A couple of passengers looked up briefly, then returned to their magazines. Clara's hands tightened around her cup. David's pen scratched across the notebook, phrase, "Your place," loaded, publicly spoken. The drink cart rolled again. Michael Torres pushed it this time, his expression focused but uneasy. He offered snacks row by row, his politeness consistent, no matter who he faced. When he reached Clara and Ethan, he crouched a little to be eye level. "Would you like pretzels or chips?" he asked warmly. "Pretzels, please," Clara said. Ethan chose chips. Michael smiled, placing the packets carefully. He even added an extra napkin, tapping the boy's shoulder lightly. "For the crumbs." Ethan giggled. Clara whispered, "Thank you." David saw the flicker of tension in Michael's eyes as Janet passed by. Glaring, she said nothing, but her posture spoke volumes. He made a note, young attendant demonstrates fairness. Conflict with senior FA expected. Time stretched. The hum of the engines grew hypnotic. David closed his eyes briefly, letting his thoughts drift back. He remembered another flight decades ago when he was Ethan's age, flying with his mother to visit relatives in Atlanta. They had saved for months for those tickets, only to be told their boarding passes were mistaken and reassigned to the back rows despite paying full fare. He still recalled his mother's quiet apology, though she had done nothing wrong. That humiliation, carried in silence, had shaped him. A soft thump pulled him back to the present. Ethan had dropped his crayons. They scattered across the aisle, rolling toward the front. Janet appeared instantly, picking one up between two fingers as though it were dirty. She placed it on the tray with a sigh. "Please keep your things under control. We have a premium environment to maintain." Clara's face flushed. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, bending to gather the rest. David bent too, scooping two crayons and placing them gently into Ethan's palm. The boy whispered, "Thanks again." "No problem," David said quietly. His eyes flicked to Janet's retreating figure. The atmosphere thickened. Subtle whispers rippled from the white fields. Robert chuckled under his breath. "Some people just don't know how to act," Eleanor replied with a murmur David couldn't fully catch. But he didn't need the exact words. The tone was enough. Janet moved briskly now, her patience thinning. When another white passenger requested an extra pillow, she fetched it with a smile. When Clara raised her hand again, Janet walked past as though nothing had been asked. Michael doubled back a few minutes later, crouching. "Did you need something, ma'am?" "Yes, if it's not too much trouble," Clara said, voice small, "just some water." Michael fetched it quickly. Clara thanked him with quiet sincerity. Janet saw the interaction. Her jaw clenched. She pulled Michael aside near the galley. Her voice was low, but David's trained ear picked up fragments. "Don't coddle them. We have limited supplies. Follow protocol." Michael nodded stiffly, his eyes darting toward David, then back to her. David's pen moved again. Internal crew conflict, pressure applied to maintain bias. The rest of the cabin seemed unaware. Passengers laughed at the movie, typed on laptops, scrolled through phones, yet in row 4, a different story unfolded, one of quiet slights, witnessed by a child too young to understand the full history but old enough to feel its sting. Ethan leaned against his mother's arm, whispering, "Mom, are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," Clara said softly, kissing the top of his head. "We're just flying." David heard the words and felt the ache in them. He lifted his coffee cup, cold now, and stared at his reflection in the dark liquid. He saw not just himself, but the boy he used to be, and the thousands of others who had carried the same invisible burden. He closed the notebook. Enough had been observed for now. He would let the situation unfold further, give them every chance to reveal themselves fully. When the time came, there would be no doubt. For the moment, the engines hummed, the cabin lights dimmed, and the microaggressions kept weaving their pattern, unnoticed by most but impossible for him to ignore. The storm had not yet broken, but he could feel it gathering strength with every mile. The cabin settled into a rhythm of low voices and soft clinks of glasses. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, a dark sheet under faint moonlight. Yet inside row 4, tension was tightening like a string pulled too taut. Janet Miller moved briskly now, her heels clicking against the carpet as she inspected seat backs and trays. Her jaw carried the stiffness of someone convinced she was in the right, and that certainty gave her a harsh energy. It began with a simple request. Clara pressed the call button, hesitant but needing to ask. Ethan had spilled a bit of water on his shirt, and she wanted a napkin. The chime sounded, but no one came. After 2 minutes, she pressed again. Finally, Janet appeared, arms crossed. "Yes," she asked flatly. "I'm so sorry," Clara said, her voice apologetic. "Could we please have a napkin?" Janet glanced at the damp spot on Ethan's shirt, then at Clara. "We've already distributed the standard set. We can't just hand out extras for every accident. This is first class, not a daycare." The words struck harder than any shout. Clara froze. Ethan shrank into his seat, tugging at his shirt as if to hide the evidence. David's chest tightened. He leaned slightly forward, his tone calm but edged. "A napkin is hardly an extravagant request." Janet's eyes snapped toward him. "Sir, I ask that you allow me to manage my cabin without interference." "I'm not interfering," David replied, voice low but steady. "I'm reminding you that courtesy costs nothing." For a moment, silence stretched between them. Passengers nearby shifted uneasily, sensing the friction. Robert Whitefield smirked, muttering. Finally, someone keeping order. Eleanor patted his arm, nodding approvingly. Janet exhaled sharply, as though granting a concession. She produced a napkin from the cart, dropped it onto Clara's tray, and marched off without another word. Clara whispered, "Thank you," though it was unclear whether she meant David, Janet, or both. Ethan's small voice broke the tension. "Mom, did we do something bad?" Clara wrapped her arms around him. "No, baby. You didn't do anything wrong." David closed his eyes briefly. He knew this was the moment microaggressions hardened into outright humiliation. His pen hovered, then wrote public shaming reference to daycare. Child internalizes guilt. The next clash came during meal service. Michael Torres pushed the cart again, carefully balancing trays. He leaned down, smiling warmly. We have chicken or salmon tonight. Which would you prefer, chicken? Please, Clara said softly. Ethan echoed her choice. Michael nodded, setting the trays with practiced ease. And for you, sir, he asked David. Salmon. David replied. Janet swooped in suddenly, intercepting the cart. Hold on, we're short on salmon. Save it for passengers in rows 1 and 2. Michael hesitated. But Mr. Lawson already requested I said save it. Janet snapped. Chicken will suffice. David folded his hands on his lap, meeting her gaze calmly. I'll take what I asked for. Thank you. Her cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth, but something in his eyes, steady, unwavering, halted her. For a moment, she seemed to teeter between defiance and retreat. Finally, with a huff, she moved aside. Michael placed the salmon dish before David, his expression a quiet apology. Robert Whitefield chuckled audibly. Some people always want more than their share. David didn't respond. He ate slowly, deliberately, each bite a reminder that dignity was not up for negotiation. As trays were cleared, the turbulence began. The plane jolted lightly, then steadied. A few passengers gripped armrests, but most relaxed again. The seatbelt sign remained off. Ethan looked frightened, clutching Clara's arm. Is it safe, Mom? It's okay, she whispered. Janet reappeared, her tone sharp. Please control your child. Nervous behavior disrupts other passengers. Clara blinked in disbelief. He's just a little scared. Then perhaps he should be in economy, where noise is expected. Janet cut in. Gasps rippled through the cabin. One passenger in row 3 turned, frowning at Janet. Michael's mouth opened as if to protest, but he stayed silent under her glare. David leaned forward, his voice low but resonant. That is enough. Janet straightened, affronted. Excuse me, you've crossed a line, David said calmly. You're not just enforcing policy. You're humiliating passengers in front of others. Robert laughed under his breath, but fewer joined him this time. Unease stirred among the others. Janet's lips curled. If you feel our service doesn't meet your standards, sir, perhaps you'd prefer to file a complaint after landing. Until then, let me do my job. I intend to, David said softly, his tone carrying weight. The turbulence smoothed out. The silence that followed was heavier than the shaking had been. Clara stared at her lap, blinking back tears. Ethan buried his face in her arm. David closed his notebook gently. His inner dialogue was steady, though his pulse raced. Patience, document everything. Let them reveal themselves fully. Justice requires clarity, not anger. Still, he could feel his restraint fraying. Every instinct told him to intervene more forcefully, but he remembered his mother's words long ago. Dignity isn't about shouting loudest. It's about standing when they expect you to bow. As the lights dimmed for rest, Janet whispered something to Eleanor, who chuckled. The sound carried across the cabin, thin and cutting. Michael passed by again, quietly setting an extra blanket on Clara's lap. She looked up in surprise. He gave a small nod, then moved on before Janet noticed. David caught the gesture. A spark of hope lit in him, proof that not everyone was blind. He turned toward the window. The horizon was nothing but black sky and scattered stars. Yet he could feel the storm inside pressing closer. This was no longer about a napkin, or a meal, or a whispered insult. This was about something larger, something systemic, woven deep into the fabric of places meant to feel safe. David breathed deeply, steadying himself, The reckoning would come. But, for now, the aisles of Summit Airlines' premier cabin carried more than passengers. They carried truths too heavy to ignore. The hours stretched forward as the aircraft carved its invisible path through the night sky. Most passengers settled into uneasy rest, but row 4 remained caught in a web of tension. Clara tried to lull Ethan into sleep, humming a tune she had sung since his infancy. His eyelids drooped, yet every small jolt of turbulence made him twitch awake again. She brushed his hair gently, whispering, "It's all right, my love. You're safe." David kept his notebook closed now, his pen idle on the tray table. He wasn't merely an observer anymore. He was standing at a crossroads inside his own mind, each incident piled on the last, pressing against his restraint like waves pounding a seawall. He could wait, gather more evidence, and deliver judgment after landing. Or he could act now, intervene before the humiliation became permanent scars for a child and his mother. Janet returned down the aisle, posture stiff, lips pursed. Her eyes landed on Clara and Ethan again. "Ma'am," she said sharply, "your son needs to remain still. Some passengers have complained about his fidgeting." Clara looked up, exhausted. "He's only trying to sleep. He hasn't made a sound." "That's not the point," Janet replied. "This is first class. Expectations are higher." She turned to David, her voice sharpening further. "And you, sir, have encouraged disruption by challenging my decisions." Several passengers stirred at her raised tone. A man in the row 3 frowned openly now. "He hasn't done anything wrong," he muttered. Janet ignored him, pressing forward. "If you cannot comply, I may have to request security upon landing." Clara's cheeks flushed with heat. Ethan gripped her tighter, whispering, "Mom, are we in trouble?" David inhaled deeply, then rose slowly from his seat. His towering frame drew silence across the cabin. Even Robert Whitefield stopped smirking, sensing the shift in energy. "Ms. Miller," David said evenly, his voice calm yet carrying authority. "You've mistaken compliance for submission. We have complied fully with every rule. What you're enforcing isn't safety, it's bias." Gasps broke out. Janet's eyes widened for a fraction before narrowing again. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm not accusing," David interrupted gently. "I'm stating a fact. Your actions speak loudly. Everyone here can hear them." Passengers exchanged glances, whispers rising. The fragile balance of silence had cracked. Robert barked a laugh to cut through the moment. "Oh, come on. She's just doing her job. If people like you can't handle first-class etiquette, then maybe enough," David said, his tone sharp for the first time. The word landed like a gavel strike. Robert's laughter died abruptly. Janet bristled, her authority unraveling under the weight of collective attention. "Sir, sit down or you'll what?" David asked softly, leaning closer. "Call security to escort paying passengers for asking for napkins, for meals they were promised, for daring to calm a frightened child." Her face flushed crimson. She glanced around, searching for support, but the cabin was no longer hers. Passengers shifted, frowning, some murmuring agreement. Michael stood frozen near the galley, torn between fear of reprisal and his conscience. Eleanor clutched Robert's arm. "Don't engage him," she whispered, but her voice trembled now. David exhaled slowly, straightening his jacket. "This is your last chance to step back. Choose dignity for yourself and for this airline." The tension coiled so tightly that even the hum of engines seemed to fade. Janet opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a chime sounded overhead. The captain's voice filled the cabin, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been alerted to a potential passenger disturbance. Please remain seated." Janet's lips curved in triumph. "Thank you, Captain. At least someone takes orders seriously." But David remained unshaken. He looked around the cabin deliberately, meeting the eyes of passengers one by one. Many looked away quickly, ashamed of their earlier silence. A few held his gaze, nodding slightly. Then, with quiet authority, he spoke not just to Janet but to everyone present. "I've stayed silent long enough, but silence is complicity. Tonight, I will not be complicit." He reached into his jacket pocket and drew out his wallet. From it, he produced a slim black card embossed with the Summit Airlines crest. The gold lettering reflected the cabin light. He held it steady, his voice clear. "My name is David Lawson. I'm not just a passenger. I'm the majority shareholder and executive chairman of Summit Airlines. This is my company, and this flight is part of my staff review." The cabin froze. Eleanor gasped audibly. Robert's jaw dropped. Michael's eyes widened in recognition. He had seen the name in company memos, but never imagined it belonged to the man seated in row 4. Janet blinked, her confidence crumbling. That's impossible. You can't." David slipped a second card from his pocket, his corporate ID, complete with photo, title, and official insignia. He placed it calmly on the tray table for all to see. "Believe it," he said softly, "because unlike assumptions, facts don't vanish under scrutiny." Whispers erupted through the cabin. A woman in row 3 muttered, "Oh my God." A man near the aisle pulled out his phone, discreetly recording. Janet staggered back a step, her throat working but no words emerging. For the first time, her authority looked hollow. David turned toward Clara and Ethan, lowering his voice gently. "You've done nothing wrong. This burden isn't yours to carry." He placed a reassuring hand on the armrest between them. Ethan's eyes, wide with awe, began to relax. Then David looked at the rest of the cabin. Every person here witnessed what dignity looks like when tested and what it looks like when denied. You will remember this moment. The plane shuddered lightly again, as if echoing the weight of his words. Janet finally found her voice, brittle and defensive. "You could have told me earlier. How was I supposed to know?" "That's exactly the point." David cut in, his tone quiet but searing. "You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect. Courtesy should not be conditional." A heavy silence followed. Even Robert, usually quick to sneer, stared at his hands. David remained standing, composed yet resolute. "When we land, there will be consequences. Not out of vengeance, but because this company cannot thrive if its service carries contempt instead of care." Passengers broke into scattered applause, hesitant at first, then stronger. Michael lowered his head in relief, clapping softly. Clara blinked back tears, holding Ethan close. Janet stood frozen, pale now, as though the ground had shifted beneath her. Her authority had dissolved, leaving her exposed not just to her boss but to the truth of her actions. David sat down slowly, adjusting his seatbelt as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet the cabin air had changed completely. What was once filled with tension now buzzed with revelation, and beneath it all, a question lingered heavy in every mind: what would happen when the wheels touched the ground? The cabin remained heavy with silence. broken only by the low hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glassware settling after turbulence. The moment of revelation had cracked something wide open. Everyone aboard felt it. Faces that once turned away from the tension now looked straight at David Lawson, some with awe, others with shame, a few with fear. Clara reached for David's hand briefly, her eyes glistening. "Thank you," she whispered. Her words carried more than gratitude. They carried relief, vindication, and a fragile hope that maybe the balance of power had shifted in her favor, if only for this night. Ethan peeked up at David, curiosity mixing with admiration. To a child who had just watched his mother shamed, David's calm defiance was nothing short of heroic. David offered the boy a gentle smile before settling back against his seat. His mind, however, was far from still. Inside, thoughts collided: anger at the humiliation inflicted, sorrow for the child's shaken innocence, and the quiet burden of leadership. It wasn't enough to reveal himself. He would need to set an example for what accountability meant right here, in the enclosed theater of this airplane. Janet stood rigid near the galley, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles whitened. The arrogance that had marked her steps earlier was gone. In its place was a brittle silence, her mind racing. She had been so certain of her authority, so sure of her judgments, and now exposed. She stared at David as though seeing him for the first time, yet part of her still sought excuses. He could have told me, he could have warned me. But deep down, another voice pierced through. Would it have changed how you treated them? Robert Whitefield broke the quiet first. "Well," he muttered, forcing a chuckle. "Guess this was all a misunderstanding." His attempt at levity fell flat. The passengers weren't laughing. Eleanor squeezed his arm hard, signaling him to silence. For once, Robert obeyed. Michael Torres edged closer to David's row. His voice, though hushed, carried sincerity. "Sir, I'm sorry. I should have spoken up sooner." David looked at him, recognizing the guilt in the young man's eyes. "Courage takes time, Michael, but every moment we delay justice has a cost. Remember that." Michael nodded, the weight of the lesson settling on him. He resolved quietly never to be a bystander again. The captain's voice returned overhead, more measured now. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation. We are monitoring the situation. Please remain calm and seated." Passengers shifted uneasily, some glancing toward the cockpit. The implication was clear. The flight deck knew something had escalated, and they were watching. Janet inhaled sharply, as if to reclaim a shred of authority. She approached David's row, voice trembling between formality and desperation. "Mr. Lawson, I didn't realize who you were." "I never intended." David raised a hand gently, stopping her mid-sentence. "That's precisely the issue. Ms. Miller, respect should not hinge on recognition. It should be unconditional." The words landed with undeniable force. A woman in row 3 whispered, "Amen." Janet's throat tightened. She looked around, searching again for validation, but the passenger's eyes told her no such refuge remained. She swallowed and retreated to the galley, her composure crumbling. David leaned back, exhaling slowly. His revelation had shifted the power dynamics, but it hadn't erased the damage done. Ethan would remember Janet's words long after this flight. Clara would carry the sting of humiliation far beyond landing. Justice had to mean more than punishment. It had to bring restoration. For the next hour, the cabin floated in uneasy quiet. Passengers whispered among themselves, careful not to break the strange gravity that now surrounded row 4. Michael checked in discreetly, offering extra water and blankets, his kindness a balm to the raw atmosphere. Clara accepted with a small nod, her shoulders finally lowering an inch. Ethan drifted into a tentative sleep, his head resting against her arm. David used the stillness to reflect. His mother's voice came back again, echoing like scripture. Power isn't proven in anger, it's proven in how you choose to heal. He knew the real work was only beginning. When the wheels touched down, decisions would follow that would ripple far beyond this cabin. Just as he began to close his eyes, turbulence jolted the plane, gasps erupted, glasses rattled, and overhead bins quivered. The seatbelt sign chimed on. Clara clutched Ethan tighter. A man in row 2 cursed under his breath. Janet's voice crackled over the intercom, brittle but trying for calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts. This is just a pocket of rough air." The plane shook again, harder this time. For a fleeting moment, everyone forgot the drama and remembered the fragility of flight. Anxiety pulsed through the cabin. David kept his gaze steady out the window, watching the lightning flicker far in the distance. He knew the turbulence wasn't dangerous, but he also knew fear made people reveal themselves. And sure enough, Robert's mutter rose above the hum figures. "Nothing goes smooth when you let anyone in here." The venom in his words cut through the dark like glass breaking. Several passengers turned sharply, their expressions hardening. This time, silence didn't protect him. A man across the aisle snapped, "That's enough. You're embarrassing yourself." Robert flushed, suddenly isolated. He shifted in his seat, grumbling, but offered no more words. David didn't intervene this time. He didn't need to. The cabin itself was beginning to find its voice, inching away from complicity. That, he thought, was the beginning of true change. As the turbulence eased, Michael passed again, offering reassurances. His hand shook slightly as he poured water, but his resolve grew steadier. When he caught David's eye, he found encouragement there, a silent promise that his courage mattered. The hours dragged toward dawn. Outside, the first pale streaks of morning light touched the horizon. The cabin stirred, passengers rubbing their eyes, stretching stiff limbs. But no one forgot the tension that had filled the night. It lingered like smoke after a fire. Janet emerged once more, her face pale, her eyes ringed with fatigue. She addressed the cabin in clipped tones. "We will begin descent shortly. Prepare your seats and trays." Her voice lacked its earlier sharpness. It sounded smaller, almost human now. David studied her quietly. He wondered what she saw when she looked in the mirror of her own actions. Fear? Shame? Perhaps the first cracks of reflection. Only time would tell. Clara leaned toward him softly. "Do you think she'll lose her job?" David considered the question carefully. "That depends on what she does with this moment. Sometimes consequences are necessary, but sometimes redemption is possible." Clara nodded slowly, as if weighing her own scars against the idea of forgiveness. As the plane began its descent, the city lights glittered below like a constellation fallen to earth. The passengers straightened their seats, buckled belts, and prepared for landing. But inside, everyone braced for something more than touchdown. They braced for judgment, for David. This was the crucible of leadership, not just punishing what was broken, but deciding how to rebuild. The descent began with a gentle tilt of the nose downward, the steady drone of engines shifting into a deeper hum. Passengers straightened in their seats, fastening belts with metallic clicks. Outside, dawn spread its pale glow across the horizon, brushing clouds in shades of silver and rose. From 30,000 feet, the world looked calm, almost forgiving. Inside the cabin, however, anticipation simmered like an approaching storm. Clara adjusted Ethan's seatbelt, smoothing his hair as he stirred awake. His small voice cracked through the quiet. "Are we almost there?" "Yes, sweetheart," she whispered, kissing his forehead. "Almost there." Her eyes flickered toward David, who sat poised with the stillness of a man who had already decided what came next. His notebook rested closed on the tray table, but the words he had written burned in his mind. He wasn't just landing in a city, he was landing into a moment of accountability. Janet walked stiffly down the aisle, her hands clasped, her voice low as she repeated the safety reminders. Gone was the commanding sharpness she had brandished hours earlier. Now she moved with a mechanical precision, as though bracing for the inevitable. Passengers watched her with a mix of unease and quiet judgment. Where once they had avoided eye contact, now their gazes followed her every step. Robert Whitefield shifted uncomfortably, his bluster gone. He kept his eyes forward, no longer daring to voice the venom he had so freely spilled earlier. Eleanor sat rigid beside him, lips pressed thin, her pearl earrings glinting under the cabin light. Their silence was a kind of confession, louder than their words had been. The landing gear groaned as it lowered. A ripple of vibration passed through the cabin, followed by the heavy thud of wheels meeting earth. The runway lights blurred past in quick succession, and the plane slowed with a shuddering roar. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, passengers unbuckled belts and reached for overhead bins, but David remained still, his presence anchoring the row. Clara and Ethan followed his lead, waiting. They could feel the gravity of what was about to unfold. The intercom chimed. The captain's voice returned, more formal now. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York. Please remain seated until we reach the gate. We ask for your patience as security and airline representatives will be boarding shortly." The cabin stirred with whispers. The words security and representatives carried weight, signaling that this was no ordinary landing. The doors opened with a hiss, and two uniformed security officers stepped aboard. Behind them came a woman in a tailored Navy suit, her ID badge clipped neatly to her lapel, Elaine Parker, Regional Operations Director. She carried herself with brisk authority, scanning the cabin with practiced eyes before focusing on row 4. David rose slowly, buttoning his jacket. Elaine approached with deference, her voice steady but respectful. "Mr. Lawson, welcome back. We've been briefed. Do you wish to address the matter here or in the terminal conference room?" Janet's head snapped toward Elaine, confusion flooding her features. The realization that headquarters was already involved hit her like a blow. Her lips parted, but no words came. David's gaze swept the cabin first. These passengers deserve to hear the beginning of accountability. We'll continue the details privately afterward. Elaine nodded crisply. "As you wish." Turning slightly, David faced the cabin, his voice carried not with anger, but with the steady timbre of truth. What happened on this flight was not just about one napkin, one meal, or one frightened child. It was about dignity, something every person here deserves without condition. What you witnessed was a failure of service rooted in prejudice, and as the owner of this airline, I will not allow it to stand." A murmur of agreement rose from passengers. Clara felt tears prick her eyes. Ethan leaned closer to her, whispering, "He's like a superhero." David turned his attention to Janet. Her posture stiffened, though her eyes betrayed the fear coursing through her. "Ms. Miller," David said, "you had opportunities to treat people with fairness, yet you chose humiliation. Do you understand the impact of your actions?" Janet's throat bobbed. I didn't realize. You thought wrong." David interjected gently but firmly. "Respect cannot be selective. It must be constant." Elaine stepped forward. "Ms. Miller, you are hereby relieved of duty effective immediately. You will disembark now with security and await further review." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Janet's face paled, her knees trembling. She opened her mouth, perhaps to plead, but the weight of eyes upon her silenced any protest. She gathered her things with shaking hands and followed the officers down the aisle. The sound of her heels against the floor echoed like the fading remnants of misplaced authority. As the door closed behind her, an exhale seemed to pass through the cabin collectively. The tension that had bound everyone together began to loosen. David turned once more to the passengers. "For those who stayed silent when you sensed something was wrong, let this be a reminder. Silence feeds injustice, but courage, even when late, can shift its course. Each of us holds the power to decide which one we offer." The words settled over the cabin like a benediction. Some passengers bowed their heads, others nodded quietly, their expressions heavy with thought. Elaine gestured toward the exit. "Mr. Lawson, the conference room is ready." David looked at Clara and Ethan. "You'll come with me. This conversation involves you too." Clara blinked in surprise. "Are you sure you endured what no paying passenger should? Your voice belongs in this room." Hand in hand, they rose together. Ethan clutched his mother's arm tightly, eyes wide as they followed David toward the exit. Michael Torres caught David's gaze one last time, mouthing, "Thank you." David nodded, his expression both resolute and compassionate. He knew Michael's journey toward courage had only begun, but seeds had been planted tonight. As the group disembarked, the morning air rushed cool against their faces. The terminal stretched ahead, bustling with unaware travelers moving through security lines and baggage claims. To them, this was just another day. To David and those from row 4, it was the threshold of reckoning. Inside the conference room, the walls were glass, overlooking the tarmac where planes moved like giant birds preparing for flight. Elaine closed the door, her notepad ready. Security officers stood near the entrance. David gestured for Clara and Ethan to sit. He remained standing, his presence filling the space. What happened on Flight 237 will not vanish into a report. It will become a turning point for Summit Airlines. Elaine inclined her head. "What measures would you like to initiate?" David looked at Clara first. "Before I answer, I want you to share your experience in your own words." Clara's voice trembled as she began. "I just wanted to keep my son safe and calm. Instead, we were treated like intruders, as though we didn't belong. It wasn't about napkins or meals. It was about being made to feel less than human. And my son, he thought he did something wrong. That's the wound I can't forget." Her words brought silence to the room, heavier than any formal statement. Elaine scribbled notes quickly, her jaw set. David's voice softened, though its core remained unyielding. That is why change cannot wait. Training alone won't fix this. We need accountability embedded into every flight, every interaction. Ethan tugged at his sleeve. Does that mean people will be nice now? David knelt so his eyes were level with the boys. It means we'll work to make sure no one else feels the way you did. It's not perfect yet, but it's a promise. Ethan nodded slowly, the faintest smile tugging at his lips. David rose again, his gaze sweeping the room. Effective immediately. I'm mandating the following: a zero-tolerance policy on discriminatory behavior, a direct reporting channel to headquarters for passengers and staff, and comprehensive equity training that goes beyond checkboxes. And most importantly, those harmed must be heard. Every complaint will receive not just acknowledgement, but resolution. Elaine's pen raced to keep up. Her eyes flicked upward, filled with both urgency and respect. Understood, sir. David exhaled, his tone heavy with both sorrow and determination. This airline will not be defined by humiliation in a cabin. It will be defined by what we choose to do after. The room fell quiet, the gravity of his words pressing into everyone present. Outside the window, another Summit Airlines jet lifted from the runway, cutting cleanly through the morning sky. For David, it wasn't just a departure, it was a reminder from turbulence. Flight was still possible. The glass-walled conference room grew quiet after David Lawson's declaration. Elaine Parker sat with her pen poised above the page, glancing up at him with both urgency and respect. Clara Johnson folded her hands in her lap, her knuckles pale, the adrenaline of the last several hours still coursing through her. Ethan sat close to her, his eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of the adult gravity pressing down on his young shoulders. David knew this was only the beginning. What had happened in the cabin could not stay contained there. The ripples were already moving outward, and the board of directors would demand an explanation. He glanced at his watch at 5:15 a.m. The emergency board session had been called for 8:30 sharp. That gave him just over an hour to prepare for one of the most consequential confrontations of his tenure. He turned to Clara and Ethan. You've been through enough for one day. Elaine will make sure you're taken care of. There's a family lounge nearby where you can rest. Clara started to protest, but David raised a hand. Your part isn't over, but right now, you and your son need peace. Clara nodded reluctantly. Ethan tugged at David's sleeve. Will you fix it? David crouched down so their eyes met. That's why I'm here, to fix it. Not just for you, but for everyone. Ethan seemed satisfied. He leaned against his mother as security guided them gently from the room. When they were gone, David turned to Elaine. I want every detail documented. Passenger statements, staff accounts, everything. Transparency will be our shield. Yes, sir, Elaine said firmly. At 8:20, David walked into the executive boardroom. The long mahogany table stretched across the room, surrounded by leather chairs. At the far end sat Arthur Gaines, chairman emeritus, his silver hair swept back, his expression stern. He had once been David's mentor but had grown increasingly resistant to the reforms David championed. Beside him sat three other directors, Martin Shaw, conservative and skeptical, Denise Holloway, pragmatic and calculating, and Victor Tran, younger, ambitious, always gauging which way the wind blew. Their faces told the story before a word was spoken. They had heard the reports, seen the early clips circulating online, and smelled scandal. Arthur spoke first, his voice clipped. "David, we hear you disrupted a flight." David didn't flinch. "I didn't disrupt a flight. I prevented a failure of our core values from becoming permanent damage." Martin leaned forward, steepling his fingers. "The media is already sniffing around. There are whispers of videos trending. Do you realize what this means for our stock price?" David's jaw tightened. "Do you realize what it means for our integrity?" Denise tapped her pen against her notepad. "Let's be clear. A lead attendant was relieved of duty on the spot. That's unprecedented. Are you prepared for the union backlash, arbitration lawsuits?" "Yes," David replied without hesitation, "because the cost of silence would be far greater. We are not in the business of humiliation. We are in the business of dignity." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Dignity doesn't pay dividends. Investors want stability, not crusades." David's voice sharpened, though he kept it calm. "Stability built on injustice is a house of cards, one gust of truth, and it collapses. What you call a crusade, I call survival. Do you think passengers will keep flying with us if they believe our cabins are places of humiliation? Do you think talent will stay with us if they fear bias is protected more than people?" The room grew tense. Arthur's eyes narrowed. "So what's your solution?" "David, another round of training modules no one completes. More slogans plastered on the walls." David shook his head. "No. Real accountability. We're launching a direct report system that bypasses middle management. Every incident of discrimination goes straight to the executive level within 48 hours. Complaints will be tracked, patterns audited, and actions taken. Not symbolic gestures, systemic correction." Denise leaned back, considering, "And the cost." David met her gaze. "Less than the lawsuits we'll face if we don't act. Less than the boycotts already brewing online. Less than the collapse of trust we can't afford to lose." Arthur scoffed softly. "You always did love speeches. But tell me, how do you plan to handle the Whitefield family? Their lawyer already called me this morning. They're threatening litigation, claiming harassment." David's expression remained steady. "Let them. The Whitefields are not our brand. Our passengers are, and passengers saw the truth with their own eyes. If the Whitefields want to sue, I'll personally welcome their case in court. Public opinion won't be on their side." Victor smirked faintly. "Confident. Aren't you prepared?" David corrected. For a moment, silence hung in the air, broken only by the hum of the air conditioning. Then Denise spoke again, her tone softer. "What about the crew who stayed silent? The ones who didn't intervene?" David's voice carried weight. "They'll face consequences, but not just punishment. We'll build a second chance program. Those who fail to act will undergo mandatory retraining, mentoring, and service commitments. Redemption will be possible, but not without accountability." Elaine, seated at the side with her notes, added, "Passenger feedback already supports this direction. Many have expressed relief that action was taken swiftly." Arthur frowned. "And what if this all backfires? What if shareholders demand your resignation for the chaos you've stirred?" David leaned forward, placing both hands firmly on the table. "Then I will leave knowing I chose integrity over cowardice. But I don't believe they will, because this is not chaos, it is clarity, and clarity builds trust. Trust builds loyalty. Loyalty builds profit. This is not the end of Summit Airlines. This is its rebirth." The board members exchanged glances. Victor shifted uncomfortably. suddenly less certain. Denise scribbled furiously on her notepad, calculating risks. Martin shook his head but said nothing. Arthur leaned back, his expression inscrutable. Finally, Arthur spoke again. "Very well. You've made your case, but know this, the eyes of the industry are on you. Fail, and you won't just take yourself down, you'll take us all." David met his gaze steadily. "Then, we won't fail." The meeting adjourned, tension still hanging in the air like smoke after a fire. As David stepped into the hallway, Elaine caught up with him. "That was risky," she murmured. "So is doing nothing," David replied. His voice was quiet but resolute. In the distance, Clara and Ethan waited in the lounge, unaware of the storm David had just weathered. He paused before walking toward them, drawing a long breath. He knew the hardest part was still to come, not just convincing a boardroom, but reshaping a culture. Outside the window, the morning sun rose higher, casting long beams across the tarmac. Another Summit jet lifted into the sky, its silver body glinting against the light. To David, it wasn't just another flight, it was a promise waiting to be kept. The story of Flight 227 did not stay confined to the boardroom. By mid-morning, the first passenger videos had gone viral. Clips of Marcus Whitefield demanding David Lawson's removal, of Clara Johnson being humiliated, of Ethan clutching his mother's arm with tears in his eyes, all streamed across social platforms with captions that spread faster than any press release ever could. Summit scandal trended within hours. Hashtags like "Flying While Black" and "Dignity in the Air" accompanied millions of comments. Some posts were furious, some heartbroken, some deeply personal. That could have been me. One woman wrote, sharing her own story of being denied service at a hotel. Another man posted, "I fly every week." Watching this broke me. We cannot keep pretending bias doesn't exist at 30,000 feet. In a quiet hotel room across town, Clara scrolled through the avalanche of reactions, her son dozing against her shoulder. She felt a strange mix of vindication and vulnerability. Part of her wanted to hide, to retreat from the glare of the world. Another part knew that her silence would only allow the same cycle to continue. David entered the room softly, Elaine trailing behind with her tablet. He had just left the board session and carried himself with the weight of a man who had been both challenged and emboldened. "Clara," he said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but people are listening. They're listening to you." Clara looked at him, eyes tired but steady. "I didn't ask for this. David, I didn't want to be anyone's symbol. I know." David replied, "But symbols don't ask to be chosen. They emerge when truth collides with silence. You don't have to carry it alone, but your voice matters." She sighed, glancing at Ethan. "I just wanted to get my son home." David pulled up a chair. "And you will. But what happened on that plane, what you endured, it can light the path for change. I won't pressure you, but if you decide to speak, you'll have my full support." Elaine added softly, "The media already has pieces of the story. If they only hear it from the Whitefield's lawyers, it will be twisted. But if they hear your truth..." She left the thought unfinished, knowing Clara was already turning it over in her mind. Meanwhile, in the wider world, the Whitefields moved quickly. Marcus Whitefield's father, Charles, a billionaire with deep political ties, released a statement calling the incident a gross overreach of authority and framing his son as a victim of corporate tyranny. Their lawyers hinted at discrimination lawsuits not against the airline for racism, but against David personally for daring to confront their family's honor. The clash became a national debate within 24 hours. News anchors dissected the clips. Editorials ran with headlines like, "When CEOs Face Their Own Flight Crews" and "The Sky Isn't Colorblind." Activists praised David's swift response, while critics called it reckless. Shareholders demanded updates. Union representatives scheduled emergency calls. Through it all, David remained calm but determined. He knew he had ignited something larger than himself. The question was whether he could guide the fire or be consumed by it. That evening, Summit Airlines held a press conference in the atrium of their headquarters. Rows of cameras lined the space, lights glaring. Elaine stood at David's side, handing him the statement he had prepared. Clara and Ethan were nearby, shielded from the press but present as silent reminders of why this mattered. David stepped to the podium. His voice was steady, deliberate. What happened on Flight 227 was unacceptable. A passenger and her son were treated with indignity. A crew member failed in her duty, and a family attempted to leverage privilege to humiliate others. This is not what Summit Airlines stands for. The room was hushed, the cameras unblinking. We will not bury this incident. We will not excuse it. We will face it openly, effective immediately. Summit is launching the Integrity in Flight Initiative, a system to report bias directly to executives, comprehensive retraining, and a new passenger advocacy office to ensure every traveler is treated with dignity. We will not only hold individuals accountable, we will transform the culture that allowed silence. Reporters erupted with questions. "Mr. Lawson, are you firing the crew member? What about the Whitefields? Are you concerned about shareholder backlash?" David answered without flinching. "Accountability will be applied consistently. Staff members involved are under review. The Whitefields are not above the law or this company's values. And as for shareholders, the greatest long-term risk is not accountability, it is indifference." In the crowd, a young reporter named Sophia Ramirez raised her voice. "Mr. Lawson, passengers are calling you a hero. How do you respond to that?" David paused, his expression thoughtful. "I am not a hero. I am a man who happened to be on the right flight at the wrong time. The real measure is whether we change after this moment. If we do, then the passengers will be the heroes because they spoke up, they filmed, they refused to stay silent." Applause broke out, spontaneous and unplanned. For the first time in 24 hours, Clara felt something stir in her chest that wasn't fear, it was hope. After the conference, as the atrium emptied, Clara approached David. "You stood up there like you carried the weight of all of us," she said quietly. David looked at her with warmth. "I carried it with you. Clara, not for you, with you." Ethan tugged on his mother's sleeve, then looked up at David. "Did you really mean it? That passengers are the heroes?" David crouched again, smiling. "I meant every word. Heroes aren't always the ones in uniforms or offices. Sometimes they're the ones brave enough to tell the truth." Ethan grinned for the first time that day, but even as hope flickered, darker currents brewed. In a penthouse downtown, Charles Whitefield watched the press conference on a muted television. His face hardened. "He thinks he can humiliate us," he muttered to his legal team. "He has no idea who he's dealing with." The lawyer, a sharp-faced man in a gray suit, replied, "Shall I proceed with the injunction?" Charles nodded slowly. "Do it. If Lawson wants a war, we'll give him one. back at the hotel. Clara felt exhaustion finally pressing her down. She tucked Ethan into bed, then lingered at the window, staring at the city lights. She whispered to herself, almost in disbelief, Maybe this will actually change something. Her own words surprised her. For so long, hope had felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But tonight, after all the chaos, it no longer felt impossible. David, in his office, closed his laptop and leaned back. He knew the Whitefields would retaliate. He knew the road ahead would be brutal, but he also knew the tide had shifted. For the first time, he believed the fight for dignity in the skies was not just his alone. It belonged to everyone who refused to look away. The following week unfolded like a storm with no eye. Every headline carried the story of Flight 227. Every talk show dissected David Lawson's press conference. Clara Johnson's face appeared on morning newsreels, her quiet dignity contrasting sharply with Marcus Whitefield's belligerent sound bites. Ethan's tearful image was replayed endlessly, becoming both a symbol of vulnerability and a rallying cry for change. But while public sympathy leaned toward Clara and Summit Airlines, the Whitefield family counterattacked with precision. Charles Whitefield hired one of the nation's top crisis management firms, orchestrating a campaign to reframe the narrative. Television ads painted Marcus as a target of reverse discrimination, claiming Summit had weaponized race and class to silence one of America's most respected business families. In private, David watched these ads with a mixture of disgust and resolve. He sat in his office late one evening, the blinds drawn, the hum of the city outside muffled. Elaine entered with a folder, her expression tense. "They've filed for an injunction," she said. "They're trying to block the Integrity in Flight initiative on the grounds it discriminates against privileged passengers." David pinched the bridge of his nose. Privileged passengers. Elaine nodded grimly. "They're arguing that prioritizing dignity for marginalized groups is an attack on fairness for others. It's absurd. But they have powerful allies. Politicians are already picking sides." David leaned back, staring at the ceiling. "This isn't just about one flight anymore. They're trying to rewrite what fairness even means." Meanwhile, Clara wrestled with her own fears. Each time she stepped outside, she noticed whispers, stares, sometimes even support from strangers who recognized her. But she also received threats, anonymous messages telling her to stop playing victim or warning her to remember her place. At night, she scrolled through comments, her stomach tight with unease. One evening, as she tucked Ethan into bed, he asked softly, "Mom, are we safe?" Clara hesitated before answering. "Yes, baby, we are safe." But as she kissed his forehead, she wondered if her words were more for him or for herself. David, sensing her growing anxiety, invited Clara to dinner at a quiet restaurant, away from cameras, over grilled salmon and iced tea. He looked at her earnestly. "Clara, I know this has put you in a spotlight you didn't ask for. If you want, I can shield you. Take the burden onto myself." Clara shook her head slowly. "David, I don't want fame. I don't want attention. But I also don't want silence. If I back down, it's like telling Ethan that what happened to us was acceptable. And I can't do that. Not for him." David reached across the table, his hand resting briefly on hers. "Then we'll stand together. Whatever storm comes, storm indeed." Within days, Marcus Whitefield appeared on a primetime interview, his tie crisp, his voice rehearsed. "I was humiliated by that man," he said, pointing to a clip of David. "I was treated like a criminal in front of my family. This so-called initiative is nothing more than corporate bullying." Clara watched from her hotel room, jaw tightening. She wanted to throw something at the screen. Ethan muttered, "He's lying." But not everyone believed Marcus. Public opinion fractured, yes, but for every critic, there were 10 supporters flooding social media with stories of their own humiliations while traveling. This isn't new. One tweet read, "David Lawson just finally called it out." Back at Summit headquarters, the board grew restless. Arthur Gaines convened another meeting. His voice clipped. "David, you've thrown this company into the middle of a political firestorm. Share prices are volatile. Regulators are sniffing around, and the Whitefields are not backing down. How much further are you willing to push?" David's answer was calm but resolute. "As far as it takes, because if we bend now, we set the precedent that money and power can always dictate dignity, and that is a cost greater than any dip in stock value." The room fell silent. Even Arthur, though visibly skeptical, said nothing more. Later that night, David found himself pacing in his office, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. He remembered his father's words from decades ago, spoken during a quiet evening on their porch in Georgia sun. "Never let a man buy your silence. If your voice is all you have, then it's worth more than gold." Those words steadied him now. Meanwhile, Elaine worked tirelessly behind the scenes, coordinating legal responses, managing press inquiries, and advising David on each move. But she too felt the strain. One night, she confessed quietly to David, "Sometimes I wonder if we're in over our heads. They have money, influence, connections. What do we have?" David gave a tired smile. "We have truth, and we have people who believe in it. That's more dangerous to them than all their money." The fight escalated further when a video surfaced of a Whitefield fundraiser, where Marcus was overheard joking about keeping certain people in coach where they belong. The recording leaked anonymously, igniting fresh outrage. Hashtags reignited, protests formed outside Whitefield offices, and sponsors began pulling support. Clara watched the coverage, a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness washing over her. "It shouldn't take a leaked video for people to believe this happens," she murmured. David agreed when he spoke to her later, but sometimes it does. And when it does, we seize the moment. In the weeks that followed, Clara found her own courage growing. She accepted an invitation to speak at a community forum, where she shared her story not as a victim, but as a mother determined to protect her child's dignity. Her voice shook at first, but as she spoke of Ethan's tears, of the cold humiliation she had felt, the audience leaned in. Many wept openly. Some stood to applaud before she even finished. Afterward, Ethan hugged her tightly. "Mom, you were brave," he whispered. She smiled through her tears. "I learned from you. Baby, the tide was shifting, but the Whitefields were not done." Charles Whitefield convened a secret meeting with lobbyists and political allies. "If Lawson won't bow," he said, his tone icy, "we'll break him. We'll dig into his past, his business, his family. Everyone has weaknesses." Back at Summit, David sensed the pressure tightening like a vice. He knew the battle was far from over. Yet as he looked out over the city one more time, he whispered to himself, "Let them come. We're not backing down." Winter descended over the city with a brittle chill, but the heat surrounding Flight 227 had not cooled. Every newsstand, every television screen, every digital feed seemed locked in a tug-of-war between David Lawson's vision of accountability and the Whitefield's campaign of deflection. The case was no longer just about an incident aboard an airplane. It had become a referendum on dignity itself. In a crowded church basement in Atlanta, Clara Johnson stood before an audience of community members, clergy, and parents. The room buzzed with anticipation as she adjusted the microphone. Ethan sitting in the front row. Her voice wavered at first, but steadied with conviction. On that flight, I wasn't just a passenger. I was a mother trying to shield my son from humiliation. And what I've learned since is that we can't shield our children from every injustice, but we can show them how to face it. We can show them that silence isn't the only option. Applause rippled through the crowd. Some people wiped away tears. Ethan beamed at his mother, pride lighting his face. David watched from the back of the room, quietly moved. He had come not to speak, but to listen. Clara's words reminded him why this fight mattered, why he had refused to retreat even as pressure mounted. Meanwhile, the Whitefields pursued a different stage. Charles Whitefield orchestrated a press event at a luxury hotel ballroom, where Marcus appeared with polished charm. "This isn't about race," Marcus declared to the cameras. "This is about power. One man chose to abuse his position, to humiliate my family, to turn a misunderstanding into a spectacle. My family has always believed in fairness. That's what we're fighting for." The room erupted in applause from their supporters, but outside the hotel, protesters chanted with signs reading, "Dignity for all passengers and justice takes flight." Back at Summit headquarters, Elaine Parker gathered reports from the communications team. "Public sentiment is still leaning toward us," she told David. "The leaked fundraiser video damaged them badly, but they're doubling down, and their allies in Congress are pushing hearings." David absorbed the news, his expression unreadable. "Then let them call hearings. I'll testify." Elaine hesitated. "That means opening your personal history, your business decisions, everything. They'll try to smear you." David met her eyes with calm resolve. "They'll try, but we'll stand on truth. That's something they can't manufacture." For the first time since the ordeal began, Clara and David sat down together for a joint interview. The journalist, Sophia Ramirez, the same young reporter from the press conference, sat across from them in a modest studio, cameras rolling. "Clara," Sophia began gently, "you never asked to be at the center of this. Why speak out now?" Clara inhaled deeply, choosing her words carefully. "Because I don't want Ethan growing up thinking what happened to us is normal. If I stay silent, it becomes another story swept away. But if I speak, maybe we change what comes next." Sophia turned to David. "And Mr. Lawson, critics say you've turned one flight into a crusade. Do you think you've overstepped?" David leaned forward, his voice steady. "If standing up for dignity is a crusade, then so be it. I'd rather be accused of caring too much than of looking away. Overstepping is not the danger. Understepping is." The interview aired nationwide. Viewers responded with overwhelming support. Letters poured into Summit's offices, handwritten notes from retirees, emails from college students, postcards from families thanking David and Clara for their courage. But as the tide of public opinion swelled, so did the counterattacks. Anonymous articles questioned David's finances, suggesting corruption. Tabloids spun Clara's past, twisting her struggles as a single mother into character smears. Social media bots amplified the noise, sowing doubt. One evening, Clara sat in her hotel room scrolling through vicious comments, tears welling. She turned to David, who had stopped by after another long day. "They're tearing me apart," she whispered. "I don't know how much more I can take." David knelt beside her, his tone quiet but firm. "Clara, listen to me. They want you to break because they're afraid of your strength. Don't let them decide your worth. You are more than their lies." She looked into his eyes and saw not just resolve, but weariness too. "And you? How long can you carry this?" David exhaled slowly. "As long as it takes." The fight spilled into the legal arena. The Whitefields filed a defamation suit, demanding millions. Summit's lawyers countered with evidence of their discriminatory remarks, their attempts to bribe staff, their abusive behavior toward passengers. Courtrooms became stages. Journalists camped outside. The public devoured every twist inside one tense hearing. Charles Whitefield glared across the aisle at David. His voice dripped venom as he muttered, "You'll regret this. Lawson, I'll bury you." David met his stare evenly. You can't bury what refuses to stay silent. The judge banged the gavel, but the moment had already landed a clash of two worlds, two visions of justice. Amid the legal and media chaos, Clara found solace in small moments. A handwritten note slipped under her door from a fellow hotel guest read, "Thank you for your courage. You speak for so many of us." A school teacher emailed to say Ethan's bravery inspired her students to start a dignity project. Slowly, Clara realized that though the fight was exhausting, it was also planting seeds of change. David, too, reflected on the growing stakes. Late at night in his office, he replayed the words his father had once told him. "When the world pushes you down, son, rise steady, not with fury, but with dignity. That's the only revenge worth having." He carried those words like armor as the Whitefields escalated their campaign. Yet, for all their wealth and noise, cracks were forming in their facade. Sponsors cut ties, allies distanced themselves. Even some family associates quietly reached out to Summit, seeking a way to step away from the chaos. The struggle was far from over, but momentum had shifted. Clara found her voice. Ethan found his courage, and David, though weary, discovered that what had begun as a single confrontation in the cabin of a plane was now a movement neither he nor the Whitefields could fully control. As winter nights grew long, David looked out from his office window at the city below. Lights twinkled like constellations. Somewhere, Clara was tucking Ethan into bed, telling him stories of heroes who stood firm. Somewhere, strangers were writing letters, gathering in forums, raising their voices. He whispered softly to the glass, to the city, to himself, "This is bigger than us now." And for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a small, tired smile. The morning of the final court ruling dawned gray and heavy, as though the city itself held its breath. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, microphones raised like bayonets, while cameras whirred to capture every flicker of expression. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. David Lawson sat tall at the defense table, his suit crisp, his gaze steady. Beside him, Elaine Parker reviewed documents with her usual precision, while Clara Johnson clutched Ethan's hand in the gallery, their quiet presence a reminder of what had set this entire storm in motion. Across the aisle, Charles and Marcus Whitefield whispered furiously with their attorneys. Charles's face was tight, jaw clenched with the pride of a man who had never before tasted public defeat. Marcus's confidence looked brittle now, his polished veneer cracking under the weight of weeks of damning revelations. When the judge entered, silence rippled through the chamber. He spoke in a deliberate tone, reciting the findings. The defamation suit filed by the Whitefields was dismissed with prejudice. Evidence had clearly demonstrated that their campaign had relied on falsehoods. Their counterclaims of reverse discrimination were deemed baseless. On the contrary, the judge declared that Summit Airlines had acted within its rights and, more importantly, in line with its duty to protect passengers from harassment and bias. A gasp swept through the gallery, followed by murmurs of approval. Clara felt Ethan squeeze her hand, his small voice whispering. Wee One tears pricked her eyes as she bent close. Yes, baby, we won. David remained composed, though relief flickered briefly in his eyes. When the judge concluded by ordering sanctions against the Whitefields for frivolous litigation, Charles's face went crimson. He leaned toward Marcus, hissing through clenched teeth, "This isn't over." But even as he spoke, it was clear to everyone that it was outside. The courthouse steps erupted in cheers as David emerged to address the press. Clara and Ethan stood just behind him, their presence grounding him in the moment. He paused before the microphones, his deep voice carrying over the noise. This case was never about one flight, one passenger, or one airline. It was about dignity, the kind that should belong to every person who steps onto a plane, no matter their race, status, or background. Today's ruling affirms that dignity is not negotiable. It is not for sale. It is a right. The crowd roared with approval. Ethan clapped his hands, his smile wide, while Clara blinked back tears. Reporters fired off questions, but David lifted a hand gently. We are not here to gloat. We are here to move forward. Summit Airlines will continue the integrity and flight initiative, and we invite every carrier, every industry leader to join us in building skies where respect is the standard, not the exception. That evening, Clara sat with Ethan in their modest hotel room, watching the coverage on television. Ethan leaned against her shoulder. "Mom, does this mean nobody will ever treat us like that again?" She kissed the crown of his head, her heart tightening. "I can't promise that, baby, but I can promise you this more people will think twice before they do, because now the world is watching." Meanwhile, David returned to his office at Summit headquarters. The city lights shimmered beyond the glass, casting his reflection back at him. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to exhale fully. Elaine entered quietly, setting a stack of new reports on his desk. "You should rest," she urged. David gave a tired smile. "Soon, but first, a letter." He pulled out stationery and began writing in his deliberate hand. It was addressed to Clara and Ethan, thanking them for their courage, assuring them that their voices had sparked real change. He ended with a simple line. "The skies belong to you as much as to anyone. Never forget that." The following weeks saw ripples turn into waves. Other airlines announced new diversity and dignity training. Industry associations convened panels on passenger rights. David was invited to speak at universities, business conferences, even churches. His words echoed across communities hungry for leadership that combined strength with empathy. Yet, through it all, he remained humble. "This movement was not born from me. he told a packed auditorium. It was born from a mother and her son, facing humiliation with grace and refusing to stay silent. All I did was listen. Clara, too, found her life transformed, though she never sought the spotlight. Invitations poured in for her to share her story. She chose carefully, speaking only where she felt her words could heal or inspire. At a community center one evening, she told a circle of mothers, "I'm not extraordinary. I was just tired of being quiet. And maybe that's enough to begin change." Ethan grew into his role as an unintentional symbol. At school, he told classmates, "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, even big ones. But that doesn't mean we're less than them. It just means we have to remind them what respect looks like." His teachers smiled, marveling at the wisdom carried in a boy so young. The Whitefields, meanwhile, retreated from public view. Their businesses faltered, partnerships dissolved, their once unshakable influence eroded. Marcus resigned from several boards. Charles withdrew to his estate, nursing bitterness in private. Their downfall became a cautionary tale whispered in corporate circles that arrogance, when paired with prejudice, could topple even the wealthiest dynasties. Months later, Summit Airlines hosted its annual gala, celebrating milestones and employees. This year, the atmosphere carried an extra weight. David stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces: pilots, attendants, mechanics, executives, and guests. Clara and Ethan sat near the front, applauding warmly. "Tonight," David began, "we celebrate not just the growth of Summit Airlines, but the growth of our values. We have been tested, and we have emerged stronger. But let me be clear, this is not the end of our work. Discrimination does not vanish with a ruling or a policy. It vanishes only when each of us, day by day, chooses to treat others with respect." He paused, letting the words sink in. The skies are vast. They belong to all of us. And as long as I lead Summit, they will never be a place for prejudice. Applause thundered, many rising to their feet. Clara felt a swell of pride not just for David, but for herself, for Ethan, for every passenger who had ever felt small in a space meant to connect rather than divide. Later that night, as music played and glasses clinked, David found Clara by the balcony. They stood in the cool night air, the city lights twinkling below. Ethan dozed on a chair nearby, wrapped in a coat. "You've changed things," Clara said softly. David shook his head. "We changed things. Together." For a moment, they stood in companionable silence. Then Clara added, "You know, one day, Ethan will tell his children this story, and maybe they'll laugh because it will seem so far away, like something that could never happen in their world." David's eyes softened. That's the future we're working for. And in that quiet moment, beneath the starlit sky, the weight of months of struggle lifted just enough for them both to breathe easier. The story of Flight 227 would be told for years, not as a tale of scandal, but as a turning point, a reminder that dignity, once defended fiercely, becomes contagious, and though prejudice was not eradicated, hope had taken flight, soaring higher than any aircraft ever could. The story of Flight 227 carries lessons that stretch far beyond an airplane cabin. At its heart, it reminds us that dignity is not a privilege to be earned, but a right that belongs to each person. Prejudice often hides in ordinary places at a boarding gate, in a passing remark, or in the way one person is helped while another is dismissed. Left unchecked, these moments erode trust and plant deep wounds. But there is another truth here. One voice can change everything. Clara's decision to speak, David's choice to act, even young Ethan's quiet resilience, all of them remind us that courage doesn't always look like grand gestures. Sometimes it looks like refusing to stay silent when silence feels easier. For older generations who have seen the world change through both progress and setbacks, this story reaffirms a timeless principle: respect is the foundation of any just society. And when leaders embody that principle with humility and resolve, it inspires others to do the same. May we each carry this into our daily lives, treating others with empathy, standing firm when dignity is threatened, and remembering that justice begins with how we choose to act in the smallest of moments. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey. Stories like these matter because they remind us of who we are and who we can be when we choose respect over prejudice. If this story touched you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories of courage, dignity, and justice to light. Together, we can make sure these voices are never silenced.